Well lads, what would you say one of the hallmarks of skill is? Would you say that it's being so good you can predict what your enemy will do to outplay them with ease? Or maybe something more obvious, like having such good mechanics that you can just roll over every duel that you take? I would say both are applicable, but there's one that I would also like to put forward: breaking the rules. Not like that. What I mean to say is that knowing when to break the rules is the difference between an intermediate and an expert, but what exactly does this have to do with the title? Let me work backwards. I'd say everyone who plays games with the classic role trio of tank, DPS, and support has a preconceived and pretty obvious notion about what the job of the role is, especially looking at their origins in turn-based RPGs and MMOs. The tank takes attention away from the enemies and absorbs the damage, the DPS deals big damage back to the enemies, and the support heals up all the damage the team takes. And in PvE settings, this is perfectly fine. But I'm not talking about PvE games here. My focus is on PvP, specifically hero shooters. I mean, fork found in kitchen, really, who's surprised? In a lot of hero shooters, there's always this air of expectation held by the community, particularly around the lower to mid levels, that each role has their set job, and if you stray from it, you're throwing the game. The tank has to protect the team, the support has to heal 24/7, and the DPS has to do damage. Or do they? Let's get some context out of the way before I dive any further. I am primarily going to be talking about this from the perspective of Overwatch, because it's my favorite hero shooter, but overall what I do talk about will apply to all of them. Probably. When looking at this statement, there are two ways to take it, metaphorically and literally. We'll start with metaphorically, but don't worry, we'll get back to you. There's already been enough setup, and you all get it by this stage. DPS are the people who are meant to be doing the most damage on the team, but let's change the wording of something. What is their actual job? Why is this job done? And thus, how do they do it? You know damn well I didn't mean it like that. So damage needs to be put out. Obviously, it's going to be done by shooting enemies, but how are we going to shoot them? Before getting into that, let's look at what the other members of our team should be doing. Starting with the tank. They're meant to take in enemy attention and protect the team, but how it's done overall will depend on the tank in question, but there's always one thing it comes back to: space. A tank creates and holds space, space being something as arbitrarily measured as Africa's borders when France and England arrived uninvited. For the uninitiated, it's just like the center of the board in a game of chess, or how far away you are from the corner in a fighting game. Space you control is just an area, harder for enemies to access, that gives you some advantage. But don't let this make you think that more space is better. There's good space and bad space to hold, and I'll be here far longer than I need to if I keep going. So TLDR, things like high ground or natural cover are good space, while right in front of your spawn is bad space. There's a lot more nuance to it, so if you want to learn more, go watch the Spylo video. The tank, being the resident stack of HP with damage mitigation, makes them harder to kill and push back on, thus allowing them to take space for the team to act more freely the easiest. I mean, what would you rather walk towards? A nice empty space? Or the Fourth Reich? If we look at supports, the expectation is that they should help the tanks hold a space by keeping the tank alive through healing. So, looking at the other two roles, one creates space and the other assists in keeping that space held. So what do DPS do? Based on this example and what happens in 9 to 5 elo, they use the space given to them to pressure the enemy through damage, staying in range of the tank's protection and the support's healing. Now, what if I were to tell you that this whole example of expectation is wrong? Sort of. Let me explain. Let me just serve up my main point already. DPS is more than damage. The job of a DPS is more than just killing people, and I would argue it performs a job closer to the hybrid of tanks and supports, but not in the immediate way you may expect. We'll start with the buzzword of the evening, space. As I've already said, a tank's job is to create and hold space, but this doesn't fall explicitly on the tank. Think to yourself, if a tank is typically the front line and support the back line, what would DPS be? If you said something along the lines of front, mid, or backline themselves, you wouldn't be right, but you wouldn't be wrong either. Within a hero shooter, the character you play certainly dictates your position. If I see a Widowmaker charging down a Roadhog with her SMG, I will have more questions than answers. But to get back to it, a DPS's positioning is generally the most variable. Sometimes you should flank, a lot of the time you should take a separate angle, and sometimes you should stick with a team to strengthen a charge. All of these positions aid in creating and taking space for the team. A flank allows you to set up a pincer, taking on the enemy from both sides. Naturally, this comes with the benefit of the enemy needing to split their attention to deal with both parties, but the big thing is how it morphs the space held by both teams. For a simple example, in a frontal assault on both sides, space is essentially a straight line down the middle. With a flank setup, you now control the space where the rest of your team stands, but you've also taken space away from behind the enemy, giving them less safe maneuverability. An off angle achieves a similar effect, though with it you're generally in closer proximity to your team to receive aid if you need it. Having multiple angles on the enemy naturally creates space as they have less safe ground to work with. They need to cover multiple angles from which they are receiving pressure, and all of this has been without the DPS even dealing significant damage yet. The threat of the position is enough. And please don't get the idea into your head that your character restricts your options. It's not only your Genjis, your Spider-Mans, or your Skys who can flank and take angles. Anyone can. And that is where I believe the skill of knowing when to break the rules is what highlights good players. KEMMEI should rarely find herself in the enemy backline. She tends to excel at charging forward with a brawl tank, cutting off the enemy frontline from their backline support. But who's to say there aren't moments where the reverse is viable? Expectation is a tool to be weaponized. No one expects a KEMMEI to single them off when they're in the back, because it's unexpected. You catch them off guard and you can make a play off of it, one even more powerful when you have your ult. Breaking the rules we came up with on how the game is meant to be played is how you gain an advantage, but I need to stress that knowing when and how to do this is the most important part. You can't just start running it down in the backline if your team isn't in a position to respond. The goal is to create space, but the space that an individual holds means nothing until it becomes space that the team can take advantage of. Now you also have to consider that expectation is going to change depending on the skill of your opponents. Rule breaking, as I've been putting it, will be different depending on what the perceived rules are. In the first place, you should always aim for smart off angles and flanks, but knowing when to take an odd one will change. For example, in the depths of Bronze, filled with new players who don't know what they're doing, no matter what you do, the odds of them expecting it are low. I can't speak for everyone, but when I first started playing Overwatch, this was perceived as the optimal spot to hold a defense on Gibraltar by everyone I played with. This stuff will only start working when players have functioning brains and dysfunctional bank accounts. If we go higher, say Masters, a Freya hopping across the icon-walled rooftops to get a pick is completely unexpected, as players are used to her sitting in the back and poking like a sniper. Getting back to the role of DPS though, while a tank will apply pressure and achieve space through their sheer presence, a DPS does the same job, just differently. You apply pressure and help get space with your damage, and through space you can get kills and thus the objective. Your job as a DPS isn't just to kill everything you see or deal insane damage, it's to apply pressure to take space and force progress through your damage, which then opens up the possibility to take kills and more notably the objective. Hero shooters don't require people to be dead, it's not a Call of Duty deathmatch. It's certainly easier if enemies aren't breathing, but get the idea of chasing kills out of your head. If you feel like you can't make any progress and you're sitting in a choke firing back at the enemy tank in a war of attrition, take a new approach, even if it's one that lessens the damage you deal. Stats can be misleading. Someone could be pumping a tank full of lead, and since their numbers are high, no one bats an eye, but they're doing nothing to achieve space for the team. That tank can take shelter with natural cover. They probably have some amount of damage mitigation and they are absolutely receiving the majority of the healing. The space line isn't being pushed, it's barely in a tug of war. Allow me to use an example from my own time playing Overwatch competitively. I'm a DPS main, my peak was only Masters, not insanely good, but better than most. Overwatch was my first shooter, and while my mechanics are quite good now, when I was learning, my sensitivity was 20 with 18,000 DPI. My gameplay could probably give an epileptic patient a seizure with how fast my camera moved. While I settled on playing multiple roles to climb, I always gravitated towards DPS, and though my mechanics weren't good, the heroes I played always gave me an edge. Genji, Hanzo, Pharah, these were my top 3, and my positioning on them is what let me climb. I did not have good aim, but I reached Diamond within months of starting, and Masters a good year after because life can hit like a truck. The reason I rose to Diamond so quickly despite having none of what people say DPS needs in good aim was because I held awkward positions for enemies. I would aim to be on their side or behind them as Pharah, holding annoying high grounds on Hanzo or just using hit and run tactics on Genji, with my only reason for all of them just being that I died less in these positions and killed more. I didn't actually know the benefit it was bringing in terms of space or pressure or any of the buzzwords that I know now. I am proof that a DPS is meant to help the team make progress through space. Or am I? I am, but there's more to it still. A DPS is still meant to be the person who helps the team, which can be done through pressure and space, but this stuff isn't meant to be alone in a vacuum. There'll be moments where the enemy is taking an off angle onto your backline, or maybe they're going for a hard flank. A term you'll be familiar with if you played a lot of team games is peeling, running back to your team to stop the enemy from killing them. In Overwatch 1, this was commonly seen as the job of the off tank or even just the other support. The main tank could hold their own on the front line for a moment so they could afford the time to run back and help. within 5v5, this job, which was already the responsibility of DPS anyways, falls on them even more so. Not only is DPS the spear to help initiate fights and corner the enemy, but it's also the shield that stops their plans and keeps your own team alive. And it's another case where it isn't character dependent. I mean, certainly, Cassidy is going to be a lot better at shutting down the Tracer hunting your Ana than Tracer herself would be, but even the knowledge that 2 pairs of eyes are on you as you try go for a flank for your team to take advantage of can be enough to keep that enemy backline alive. The role of a damage dealer is doing damage is common thinking, but in my opinion the role of the damage dealer is supporting the team through damage. Or more bluntly put, the goal is to win, and you win by doing damage. But that doesn't mean that damage is the goal. Winning can be the fight, the point, or even just forcing a cooldown, and you do that through the threat of your damage. Yes, a dead Kiriko is always referred to an alive one, but think about it. In your games, what are the most annoying types of enemies to deal with? The flies. A Tracer or Genji who keeps bouncing in and out of your backline, threatening to kill you with their damage, but never securing that final blow, because you're lucky enough to have had Suzu thrown your way, and now you've fallen right into their trap. Forcing a cooldown, or maybe even an ultimate to be used because not using it results in a kill, can oftentimes be just as effective as the kill itself. There's no reason to chase down this Kiriko who just wasted Suzu, so join up with your team because your Junker Queen can now ult without it getting cleansed immediately, and now you've gotten the full team wipe because your damage threatened and forced their resources. Your goal wasn't to shoot, you just had to achieve it through shooting. A phrase you may be familiar with is that the threat of something can often be more threatening than the actual thing. In Overwatch this can apply to a lot, but the most common one is Sombra EMP, but I said we'll get back to her in a moment, so let's look at Widow instead. The threat of Widow's one-shot forces you to take safer, potentially longer approaches because the space that she commands is stronger than anything else. The Widow may not even have the best mechanics. For all you know, they could be a magazine with all the body shots that they hit, but the fact that you could get one shot from halfway across the map is enough to change how you interact with the game. Damaging without purpose is just wasteful. You charge enemy ultimates, giving them free resources. It's damaging with intention and knowing the utility that damage can bring, which gives DPS depth. Thinking that your job is to do damage is actively making the game harder for you. All you're achieving by rolling your face over the keyboard into the enemy road dog is more ult charge for the enemy, and I've just been talking about Overwatch. Damaging enemies for no reason in a game like Marvel Rivals, where support ultimates are actually the Dota 2 pause button reincarnated, is actively what loses games. I've always personally viewed DPS as the most flexible role. You get the most choices in your gameplay, which is why I enjoy it so much. So part of why I say and believe in all of this is just because it's how I like to play the game. Your positioning is team dependent yet free. If you think your team just can't deal with an enemy that's focused on them, you can be the person that takes that focus away, potentially letting them get the edge in. Something about the unexpected nature of the role is what keeps me attached. People sell the role as a killing machine, when in actuality it's a pressure tool. Obviously they output the highest damage, but high damage is the biggest and easiest way to force opponents to change what they're doing, or they die trying. I've already stated how DPS is meant to help the tank in the goal of taking space, effectively meaning tank and DPS share the same job, and support players, don't you think you guys aren't meant to do this either? But I would argue it doesn't end there, and that DPS shares another role with support as well. I've already mentioned peeling to protect the team, but like space, that is realistically a team-wide job. So what do they share? Pop quiz, what's a support's job?
Healing?
Obviously, the common job supports hold in hero shooters is outputting healing in some capacity. We're getting there. But I would argue the real role is one of two things. Providing team utility, whether it's buffs or protecting the team and keeping them alive, generally done through healing, but also possible through other methods, such as bonus HP, temporary invulnerability, really whatever the dartboard hits. The alternative option is enemy disruption, think crowd control or debuffs. We've already reached the end of the metaphorical discussion, so now it's time to get messy. I love utility DPS. The more Overwatch I play, specifically ranked in more recent seasons, the more and more I start to love Mei. Previously playing her in Overwatch 1 scrim environments is what made me love her, but it's only grown and it's all because of Wall. Before Hazard or Lifeweaver, Mei was the only character in Overwatch capable of creating terrain, and of the bunch, I think she still has the best for isolation. I said it earlier on, but walling off a straight target and killing them before their team can help is a sadistic joy of mine. Mei also has what is probably the strongest slow in the game in terms of its uptime thanks to her primary fire, an extremely fun secondary fire that's actually quite threatening in both its range and damage, giving her that traditional space creation from the damage side, and with her ult being a zone that freezes enemies caught in it, she's perfect at actually controlling space, especially the point, no matter the game mode. But all of this being said, even though Mei is by far my favorite utility DPS, and in all the games I play I would argue the best, that doesn't actually mean she's good. Let's start simple. Ice Block is just awkward. I'm not gonna act like it hasn't saved my ass. There are so many overtime situations where the healing has gotten me my ult and let me get back the point, but that's also my problem. Full invincibility is a strange mechanic to balance, and a hard one at that, but Ice Block meets some requirements of it in theory. Mei can't fight back against you if she's in Ice Block, she can't even move let alone shoot, so if she times it badly, she could be left isolated for the enemies to easily kill. So in concept it's not too bad, but an easy fix for Mei to keep pressure up in this low pressure mode is to wall off the enemy, place down Blizzard if she has it, and if she was going to die, Ice Block saves her, while enemies get frozen and killed. It's an ability that removes interaction for enemies. Sure, if you use it badly it could get you killed, but in that case, just don't use it badly. I also find it to be at odds with her kit. For a character all about taking space and quickly turning enemy space into your own, having an ability where you forfeit your options to take advantage of that space seems backwards. And I haven't even mentioned the elephant in the room, freeze. I will say I think Mei ult freezing you is perfectly fine. There's time to react, the projectile can be stopped, and a multitude of ways to save allies caught in it exist. What I don't think is fine is her primary fire freezing. In Overwatch 1, Mei's primary fire would freeze after being held long enough, with Overwatch 2 doing away with most hard CC, freeze left in place of a stronger slow, a change which I am all for. I definitely love being the most evil person on the planet, walling off the enemy tank and freezing them so they can't even protect themselves and lose half their HP for daring to overstep, but I'll also be the first to say, that's not really the most fun to play against, lads. However, a few months ago, Mei got a perk which brought freeze back, and if anything, it's worse, since her slow is stronger than the previous iteration, making it even harder to escape her. Utility DPS are nearly never made well. They always have some type of issue in their design, which either makes them weak, problematic, or just a little boring. More aptly put, uninteractive. With Mei, she certainly isn't weak, but Freeze and Ice Block will always put her into that uninteractive camp. Her slow, wall, and blizzard are fantastic team utility which I will always defend, but Ice Block adds very little, and her Cryostorm perk takes away the one weakness that it's meant to have. If you take Deep Freeze over Cryostorm, having a stun be that frequent just is not that healthy, especially in a game which aims to remove a lot of its hard CC. While I still think that Mei is a rare utility DPS that provides value to the team in both her utility and her damage potential, allowing her to fill multiple roles as a DPS, that doesn't mean it's done perfectly. She's a great example of how even when a utility-oriented damage dealer can do well, a lot of the time they just aren't built well. Or in some cases, they just aren't received well. Ah, lads, that's too much water. Sombra and Symmetra. Some of you may remember that I spoke about these two in their own videos over a year ago. Now, I'm not that proud of these videos. I raised some good points, but the quality just isn't up to my current standards. However, this time I've had a lot of new thoughts to sort out, especially about Sombra, who's getting another rework at some point within the next decade, but let's start with Sim. Alright, old Sim was a support. She had no healing, barely any shielding depending on the version, and the protection she offered against flankers came from 6 1 HP turrets that hated to see a diva coming so much that at least one of them turned misogynistic. The best use old Sim had was her ultimate, teleporter or shield generator, but this ult would tend to struggle outside of 2CP game modes, and her crippling lack of range combined with the lack of tools to make up for this weakness meant that even if her damage could be strong after ramping up, old Sim is an easy case of a utility not yet character who had issues in her reception due to her lack of strength. I've already pointed out her weaknesses, but the big thing was that she didn't do any healing. For that matter, she actually did no healing. This was at a time when there was no passive healing and a Mercy being on the team drastically increased survivability. So one team having a Mercy for support while the other had a Symmetra, even if it were to be her iteration where she gave shields outside of her ultimate, it just wasn't going to keep up. so very few players liked having a Sim on their team because she just didn't provide enough, whether it was damage, utility, or healing, which led to her getting reworked into a DPS, instilling more damage into her kit. This is the most common and saddest route that you will see. Now, I will be honest, I know that Sim was labelled as a support who then got reworked into a DPS, but lads, let's be so for real for a moment, she was always a DPS leading design, even though it was unintentional at first. No iteration of support Symmetra actually had enough utility to be genuinely considered a support if her ult wasn't active. A shield which automatically moves forward, temporary shields to give to allies, and a slow on short range turrets that explode when the wind changes isn't enough to actually help the team. It's reactionary. You could not be proactive with her tools. And when her ult was up, its strength heavily depended on the map you were playing on. If we wanted a real support sim, so much of that old variant would have to be reworked to the point of nearly being a different character, though I won't act like I wouldn't want to see that in action. To get back on track, let's look at a different game with Marvel Rivals and Storm. The first version of Storm sucked. As a DPS, she didn't bring enough damage to the table to pose a threat to create space. Remember, damage isn't the purpose of the role, but it is how it helps the team. Also, as a supportive DPS, she didn't bring enough support either. Her aura used to only give allies half the boost she received, giving them 8% bonus move speed and an 8% damage boost, depending on the one chosen. Now, in fairness, an 8% damage boost that's always active, not too bad at all, but move speed only being 8%, sure, her amped up version brings it to 20% for allies, but that's still not enough of a reason for it to be used as team utility. Storm would just keep that aura boost for herself for mid-duel advantage rather than pre-fight support. There's also an anti-synergy within aura, being that Storm is a flying character and her aura is a sphere, meaning that despite how she wants to be high enough in the air to get better angles for her primary fire, it means that her team gets less of a benefit from the aura because the range gets smaller. So we have a character whose damage is too low for her to apply meaningful pressure by herself, and whose team support is at odds with itself and also not that impactful in the first place. This is another common issue that a utility DPS faces. Finding a nice balance between damage and utility is something I have rarely seen done well. And when a character is weak because of this, most of the time one simple change is made. The damage gets cranked up, sometimes even at the cost of the utility. We see this within Sim's rework, though I will stand by the fact that her utility is actually stronger now, it's just that there's less of it across her kit, but I digress. With Storm, they took it to heart, and ramped up her damage in the next patch to the point where she became the strongest DPS in the game, and her tornado ran through all of my points and the title because oh my god, that was too much damage. Now, in my own opinion, I don't think creating a DPS who has strong utility while still having threatening enough damage is hard. I mean, to stick with Storm, I simply think making Aura a cylinder in its ally effects alongside some slight number tweaking would have been enough to give her a boost in terms of her team support, but often if the first attempt fails and the general public perceives them as being weak due to having low damage, the pedal gets slammed down and the character gets nearly all of their power shifted over to having higher damage numbers, homogenizing them with the cast, or their utility stays the exact same, only their damage output is way higher and they just become borderline broken. The case of a character becoming way too strong while keeping their utility is pretty rare, though from what I have seen at the very least. I only know of Storm. Either way, the notable thing isn't the aftermath of the character's strength. They could be stronger, weaker, whatever afterwards. One thing nearly never changes, which is the impression. A phrase you'll often hear in real life is that first impressions are important, but this is also true in games. Even though Cyberpunk 2077 is fixed and functioning now, there are still people who don't want to try the game or think it's still bad, all because of the botched launch. Even though the PS3 pulled a huge comeback in the final years of its life, people still think the Xbox 360 won that generation because that launch price was ridiculous. Even though Brig is nothing close to her release version and has been fully reworked since, there are still people who act like she's the most broken character in the game. Sombra hate is ridiculous, overblown, and born from both a lack of skill and a lack of wanting to actually engage with the video game. But it's also born from way too many bad first impressions. I'm not going to go over every version of Sombra, but just to cover the bases on the elephant in the room. Original hack shut you out of your abilities for 6 seconds, it was later changed to also shut off passives. In Overwatch 2, the ability lockout was brought down to 1 second, though it could be spammed on the same target continuously, later removed. One rework had it at 1.5, and her most recent brought it back to 1. Hack has always been the problem in Sombra's kit that leaves the biggest impression. Of course it will, since it directly affects and creates frustration. Ult hack with its 6-second ability lockout, even in Overwatch 1 with an extra player to maybe stop it, was fairly ridiculous. Being locked out of your abilities for 6 seconds in a game as fast-paced as Overwatch is just flat out annoying. Even with the counterplay, nothing can undo how frustrating it is. And this is where a lot of Sombra hate is born from. That original CC potential is just driving people wild. The first impression was annoying to play against, and many viewed her as not being worthwhile to play with, in part because her damage was so low to the point she could barely make space by herself. So she got a rework. And another. And another. And another. And another. With each rework, Sombra has been brought further away from utility and closer to Teemu Tracer. In Overwatch 1, the changes were on the tamer end, but in Overwatch 2, it couldn't be more blatant. Yet despite this, the first impression of her utility was her undoing. Even though hack duration was only a second, because she could hack through invis and repeatedly on the same target, the same level of frustration was present, nearly worse as with a single tank, they generally took the brunt of it. A big thing I have always advocated for in regards to Sombra is that invis is a bigger problem than hack overall, but it's the combination of the two that brings Sombra to the peak of her frustrating potential. Don't get me started on the perk. I play a lot of games that have invisibility as a mechanic, and while Sombra does a good thing in revealing herself to enemies in close range, that doesn't change the general issue frequent invisibility has. For a side tangent, Evelynn in League of Legends has a passive where past level 6, which is quite early in the game, she will be permanently camouflaged unless she is in combat. In a game as reliant on vision and knowledge of the enemy's positions as League is, it's made her quite the problem child at various points in the game's life. In Overwatch, knowing the position of enemies is equally as important, with Sombra being able to hide this fact permanently at a few stages of her life is giving her the combination of being able to be anywhere to then jump you with a hack. So let's return to that button from a team perspective before I start complaining about the general public. Hack has always been great team utility, but there's a key issue it has which causes players to think Sombra hack is weak utility or that her damage needs to be higher because she's not doing enough, which is sort of true, but we'll get back to that. Anyway, one problem is that Sombra, like most utility DPS, but I would argue even more so, requires her team to work with her. She needs her team to engage with the game she enables. Hacking a Sigma or Diva allows Zarya grab to be sent out with no concerns of being eaten, but it requires coordination on all sides, especially in Overwatch 2 with the ability lockout only being a second. It can't be reacted to the same way that something like a Mei wall can. Mei wall is a big visual cue that even the most asleep of tank players will notice and charge towards upon seeing only one red person instead of 5. Sombra hack is certainly noticeable, but since it forces her team to play her game in order to take advantage of it, her impact is severely lessened. And the same can be said when playing against Sombra. Hack is an ability entirely blown out of proportion by negative impressions from old versions. Sombra hack takes just slightly over a full second to complete, not counting the 0.3 seconds fading in from invisibility takes. When you see a Sombra locked in on the enemy, you should expect her to appear at a different angle around you before hacking. If she was invisible before this, you will have the time to react and shoot her. I have a below average reaction time, my average is just hanging around 300 milliseconds, but because I know Sombra is on the enemy, I'm expecting her to hack me. I can react to it and I can stop her. I have some element of knowledge that she will try and appear to try and hack me. You could argue that you can't stop her if your abilities are on cooldown or you're reloading, but at that point you're at a disadvantage versus any character who engages on you, and it's in good engagement by the Sombra, who at that point probably wouldn't even need the hack if it weren't for the fact that Sombra's damage actually relies on hacking you, with hack at all stages of Overwatch 2 providing her with some kind of damage increase, which she actually needs to have the threat of damage we discussed earlier with the role of DPS. Currently, virus impact damage is doubled if Sombra gets a hack off, and she gets a 20% damage buff against hacked targets, which is the only state in which her damage becomes a threat to actually play around. Someone like Tracer always poses the threat of damage to create space. For Sombra, she needs an ability to enable herself to take the space instead of having it to start with. Sombra's pressure has a 1 second preparation window before it can actually provide value. That same ability, which is meant to be her utility, is tied to her damage, removing the flexibility that the nature of a utility DPS is meant to provide. Sombra changes the game you're playing. You have to play on her terms no matter the team you're on, but if you step up and take her head on, you'll be in a stronger position because you actually engage with the game state. Sombra isn't liked, not just because of her stance as a utility DPS, but because she takes you out of your comfort zone if you want to take her on. she ends up with the highest ban rate and simultaneously the most wasted ban slot. The many bad impressions the community has had regarding her have been one of the driving factors in turning her into this horrific utility to enable damage hybrid. Now, in complete fairness, if a character has a 90+% ban rate and has received various reworks during their life, something is obviously off, and the negative reaction from the community needs to be taken into account. But that negative reaction is also coming from people who refuse to acknowledge the type of character that they're playing against and think that the enemy is going to play their game as if the entire lobby revolves around them and that they're the protagonist, when in reality the entire point and most fun aspect of hero shooters is how each character has their own tools and their own unique approach to the game that forces every player in the lobby to acknowledge their tools, their team's tools, and the enemy's tools to come up with a way to enact your game plan while making it fit in and around everyone else's and not letting it get derailed by considering what enemies actually want to do, which is also why the more fighting games that I play, the more I actually really start to respect that genre, because it's all about taking your game plan and the enemy's game plan into account in order to actually win, but going from the 1v1s of Guilty Gear to the 5v5 or 6v6 of hero shooters, which have a similar concept but expanded dramatically, is part of the reason I continue to come back to them every single time. So refusing to play around the tools of an enemy and then complaining when they use those tools against you is really just pathetic. And of course, that's the big issue all utility and team-oriented, forget DPS, characters end up having. Everyone only wants to play the game that their character wants. We want to take it easy and don't want to consider the better way to play around our team and the enemy. And it's characters that require that engagement from all sides who get shoved closer to the expectation of their role and further away from their uniqueness.
DPS is more than damage. This is true in both the literal and the metaphorical sense. Yes, its ability to do the jobs of other roles still relies on its ability to do damage, but that's true of every role. Stats can be misleading. It doesn't matter if you have 20,000 healing because you've done nothing to progress the game state. It doesn't matter if you have 20,000 damage because all you've done is throw it into the Roadhog for the last 3 rounds. Just like in real life, action with intention is always going to be better than action for the sake of action. And I feel like this is an important part to mention that I did intentionally run over the person who said that they weren't the problem because they had gold damage back in 2018.